Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I am absolutely thrilled to be presenting this work to you guys today. Our three speakers, I'm one of them, but the other two are amazing. And I'm really looking forward to chatting with everybody about empowering renters through energy efficiency labels in rental listings. Now, while we're waiting for everybody to sort of shuffle into the virtual room, I would love for you to just open up the chat and tell us where you're from, maybe your affiliation, and why you're here. What do you want to learn today? I'd love to hear from folks. So if you could just open up that chat and type in why you're here, where you're from, what you want to learn, that'd be great. You don't have to provide all those things. You can just put one of those three. I know I'm asking a lot here. The chat button should be at the bottom of your, oh, hey, Keith from NYSERDA. Great to see you. Thank you for supporting our work. And I love the work that NYSERDA is doing. Mike Zatz, Energy Star. Oh, I'd love to see people from Toronto. That's my hometown. We've got people from all over the country, it looks like. Tacoma. This is really coming in fast. Portland, Oregon. CE folks. Sacramento, Off the Wall Energy, thank you. Minneapolis, well, that's great. We do have a speaker from Minneapolis. Nova Scotia, Canada, go Canada. And Tampa, so we're looking at all the different climates and regions across North America. That's fantastic. Edmonton area, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, Sacramento. So big cities, small cities, rural, and mostly urban, it looks like. But we're serving a lot of folks. So this would be great. I'm looking forward to this chat and discussion as we go through the presentation today. So I'm the host of today's webinar as well as one of the speakers. My name is Ruben Sussman. I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, which is more easily just known as ACEEE. I also co-chair the BEC conference, Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change. And on the side, I'm an adjunct professor in the psychology department at the University of Victoria in Canada. So while we're here, you already have started to learn about the chat. The chat's a great way to chat with other folks in the room, even though you can't see each other. You can talk with each other and comment on what you see and hear in real time. We'll be looking at the chat, but mostly we'll be looking at the Q&A button. There's also a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen. You can put in a question at any time, and you can upvote the questions that you like using a thumbs up button. So if you click on the Q&A, you can see what questions have been asked. You can upvote the ones you like. And after all the sessions, we'll answer as many of your questions as we can using that Q&A function, and might also bring up some stuff that's come up in the chat. So also, before we get started, I want to quickly bring your attention to the BEC conference. If you're interested in the nexus of this kind of research on climate, energy, getting people to save energy using behavioral science, I highly recommend this conference. This year, we have a virtual day on November 9th, followed by the in-person conference, the 13th to the 16th of November. So, without further ado, let's get started. We have three speakers today. I'll kick things off. Then we have Jackie Bauer from Rent Lab, and then Luke Hollenkamp from the city of Minneapolis. So my talk today is going to be about an experiment that we conducted. We title Energy Labels Affect Behavior on Rental Listing Websites. I'm the lead author, but Hannah Bastian was also a big part of this. And there's a lot of other authors that played very important roles. Steve Conrad, Emma Cooper, Elizabeth Tong, and Sherpa and Shiva Purfulatun. Sorry if I mispronounced that name. And if you want, the report for this experiment is out now. You can download it from the link below. And at the end of the session, I'm going to put it into the chat as well. So to get started, how many of you have found yourself in this position? Maybe you're renters, maybe you're home buyers, but you didn't know how much the energy costs would be before you moved into your house. Then you move in, you're like, whoa, way more than I expected, way more than the last house. And you know what? This happens a lot. And we're hoping that by encouraging or mandating labels on rental listings, that this will happen less often, and that people will start valuing energy efficiency. Maybe that might nudge landlords. But let's not get into that yet. Let's talk about the experiment, what we did. First, what did we want to learn in our experiment? We had three questions. Number one, Do renters choose more efficient rental units when listings contain energy efficiency information? Pretty basic question, but if the answer is no, then why bother putting the energy information in? So we want to check that first. Second, which labels are the most effective? And we had some ideas based on theories from psychology, behavioral science, previous work, but we wanted to test them in a real life sort of situation. Sort of real life situation. And finally, which renters value energy efficiency the most? This might help people, organizations and individuals that want to affect behavior to target the best groups to target. So the experiment itself, we simulated rental listing search results. And I'll show you what that means in a moment. Because it was a simulation, we were able to carefully control all the rental listing attributes and use the ones that come up most frequently in a real life situation to present to people. Then we displayed, along with those regular rental listing attributes that you always see, energy efficiency information. And people who saw the energy information were randomly assigned to see it in different ways. And if you're randomly assigned to the control group, you saw what was kind of like a regular rental listing website with no energy information. So we can see how much the energy information affected people's behavior by comparing them to the ones that didn't get the information. We asked renters to pick their preferred home from a series of search results, or actually a series of choice sets that were carefully crafted. And using those carefully crafted choice sets and people's selections of homes, we are able to use the magic of statistics to calculate the likelihood of clicking on the most efficient listings and on the least efficient listings, and how much people were willing to raise the rental price in exchange for more efficient rental units. All right, so let's get into it. First of all, a little bit more detail. If you were a participant and you logged into this experiment, this is what you would see. The first splash page, we had this, an intern create this lovely diagram, or figure, I should say, at the top, Rent Dragon. And after you click through, you say, okay, this is what I expect to pay per month. I probably will get a house, and I prefer, 3 bedrooms or whatnot. Then people see their search results as 6 sets that look like this. And we use the information they put in and we pivoted around that information to give them a variety of options that had, 3 levels of bedrooms that were rotated among the options, 4 levels of bathrooms, 4 price levels, and, they combine them in different ways. And this is what you're looking at is the control condition, because as you can see, there's no energy efficiency information. But if you were randomly assigned to one of the efficiency conditions or intervention conditions, you actually saw the energy information. So if you were randomly assigned to one of the energy cost label conditions, this is the first one, you just saw the monthly energy bills for that unit. And as you can see, there's no context information. It's just a number. It doesn't say what the best is or what the worst is or anything like that. And in the past, we found that that might not work so well. So what we did is we then created energy costs along a continuum condition. Here you see the energy cost, but it's along a continuum from what could be the best possible case or the worst possible case for the area you wanted to live in. I should say it's broken up by state, but we don't need to get into the details of how this is calculated in the back end for our purposes here. Although I'd be happy to chat more about that if anybody's interested. And then here, the rental costs are just baked into the rent. Sorry, the energy costs are baked into the rent. And that was the case for all the options that people in this condition saw. So we changed the rent, but based on the energy costs, but people didn't know how much the energy costs were in addition. Okay, if you were randomly assigned to one of the energy score label conditions, you either saw the energy score at a 10 or you saw the energy score along a continuum. And then finally, there's one other condition people could have been randomly assigned to, and it's the voluntary label condition. Here, you saw basically what the control condition saw, just information, the basic information without energy, but the most efficient homes, rental units in each set had this additional information, the score and this sort of certification. And we wondered if maybe this is kind of what happens in a voluntary condition, where only the most efficient homes get labeled usually. We wanted to see if this would change behavior also. So first question, do renters choose more efficient rental units when listings contain energy efficiency information? Yes, we're very happy to see that when we combined all the intervention conditions, compared them to the ones that didn't see any energy information, people did select the most efficient units 21% more often, the least efficient units 21% less often. So if you think about it, they saw 6 choice sets, they could have selected the most efficient up to 6 times. When they didn't see the information, they selected the most efficient about 2 times out of the 6. But when they did see these labels, they selected them closer to 2.5 times out of 6. When they saw, same thing, when they, for least efficient, when they didn't see the information about energy, they selected the least efficient option about 2 times. But when they saw the label, they selected it only about 1.5 times. And that varied depending on which label they chose. So let's get into that now. Which labels are most effective? So there's 3 ways we looked at which one's most effective. The first one was how often did they click the most efficient option? And remember, they can click it up to 6 times. So in the control condition, they clicked it just under 2 times. In 4 of these conditions, or 5 of them rather, they clicked significantly more often on the most efficient options. But I will note that the monthly energy bills, the one with very little context information, even though it was significantly better than the control, it wasn't very good compared to these other ones. These ones are very similar. This one's quite a bit lower, especially when you compare it to the home energy score out of 10. And this voluntary label, unfortunately, was better, but not statistically significantly better. Now, we can also look at it the converse way. How often did people click on the least efficient option? Out of 6 clicks, this is the control. Now we want to see, there was 5 labels that were they got people to click significantly less on the least efficient options, and it's the same ones. But once again, you can see the monthly energy bills didn't work quite as well as these other ones. And the voluntary score was not statistically significantly better. Now, the last way we want to look at is how much were people willing to increase their rent in exchange for a 1 unit increase in home energy score. So this is, you can move from a 2 to a 3 or 3 to 4, 4 to 5, et cetera. How much would people be willing to pay on average for a 1 unit move? And we calculate in terms of percent of rent that was listed in the listing. So these 3 were quite good. Seeing the monthly energy bills along a continuum, where you see the context, the home energy score along the continuum, and the home energy score out of 10. And this is the context here, as you see, out of 10. So you know what the maximum is. When people just saw the monthly energy bills and the energy was included in rent, the willingness to increase rent was much lower. Still important though. In today's rental market, if you were to translate this to like what an average rental costs, you can see it's like $522 a year, even $250 a year if you include the monthly energy costs as baked into the rent. Of course, if you increase it by more than 1 unit, which a lot of apartments have the ability to, these numbers go up higher by, multiplied by 2, 3, 4, whatever increase it is. And many buildings also have multiple units, so this could really aggregate. All right, which of renters value energy efficiency the most? I'm going to blaze through this because I don't have too much time, but those in the West were willing to pay the least. Those in in hot and cold climates were willing to pay the most. So there's a little caveat here that there was very few people in these climate zones. So, take this with a grain of salt. Apartment renters seem to be willing to pay a little bit more in terms of percentage and absolute amount. And people who expected to spend more on their rent in general were willing to pay a smaller percentage. So people who were spending, up to $1,000, the percent they were willing to increase their rent for 1 unit increase in energy score was, about 1.4, 1.5. But for those who are willing to or expecting to spend 1,000 to 5,000 or more. And I say 5,000 plus because our scale maxed out at 5,000. So anybody who wanted to spend more would reach that end. This was statistically significant. They tended to want to spend a little bit less on energy efficiency. So the key takeaways: energy information does lead to clicking, as I should say, selecting more efficient rental units. Voluntary labeling, that means only the most efficient, was less effective in our situation. That's not to say that these are ineffective. In fact, the Energy Star label does work in many contexts and is very important. But in our study, it seemed to be not statistically significantly effective. That's not to say we shouldn't use it, but I'll get into that later. High context labels seem to be the best. When you just present like the dollar amounts without context, it's not as effective. But more importantly, when you remove the comparison information and only some homes are labeled, it's less effective. So that's the less context. You might want to target renters, lower priced rentals, because they're willing to pay a higher percentage increase for efficiency. And renters in milder climates, so not in the West and in generally more mild climates, seem to be willing to pay less than those in hot or cold climates, which makes sense because you get more bang for your buck with efficiency in the hotter or colder climates. So let's talk about policy recommendations really quickly. We suggest requiring disclosure of energy use information at the time of the listing. And this is important. Not many cities or local governments at this point do that. We want people to be able to see the energy efficiency when they're making a decision. Use a multi-policy approach. So don't just require an assessment and posting of the energy score, because that could unfairly affect people who are selling homes that are inefficient, maybe lower cost homes, or sorry, not selling, but renting. So use a multi-policy approach. Also enact policies that help them improve the efficiency of their homes at the same time. Move toward context-rich labels and away from voluntary labels if possible. And use an intuitive rating system, one that's clear and you don't have to really think too much about it. Energy score is a really simple thing that people seem to understand. And last, I just want to plug again the BEC conference. If you're interested in this kind of work, please consider registering and joining. You can get more information at becconference.org. Thank you so much. I am very excited to now turn it over to our second speaker, Jackie Bauer, co-founder and CEO of RentLab. Jackie, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Great. Great. Oops. It will not. There we go. Okay. Can everybody see that? Can everybody hear me? Okay, great.
Looks good to me.
Okay, so thanks so much. So excited to join the webinar this morning. Just a quick introduction of me. I come from an urban sustainability background. I've spent many years as the sustainability coordinator in Bloomington, Indiana. And everything I do with RentLab emerged out of that work. So big shout out to the Urban Sustainability Directors Network for the early support they provided for this when I was still back at the city. But early on in that work, Bloomington, Indiana, we really discovered, how big of a struggle it was to address the rental sector and really try to move the needle on efficiency and sustainability in that sector. So since leaving the city, my whole focus with RentLab has been on creating tools that enable cities to better tackle the rental sector as they pursue their climate action and sustainability goals. So what we do is take publicly available data, integrate it with other data that we pull together. We've created a public-facing map interface aimed at getting tenants and landlords to engage with this data. And then we work with cities on analyses and strategies to help them address their own rental sectors. So of course, we're focused on reducing energy burdens, moving the needle on rental housing sustainability and efficiency, and on helping cities move toward their carbon neutrality goals. We're focused early on a sort of carrot-based approach. We really try to focus on celebrating the best performers first, rather than diving in with sort of shaming the least the lowest performers. But as no one here will be surprised to learn, our biggest challenge is getting tenants and landlords to engage with this information, with sustainability and efficiency information, when they're making housing and investment decisions. So, and of course, related to that, most people working in the rental sector know the split incentive problem as a driver of why the rental sector is so complicated. So just a quick overview of that. In an occupied home or building, market incentives work. So if the owner makes investments in efficiency improvements, they actually reap the benefits in the form of reduced bills. In the rental sector, that's broken. So tenants don't have any incentive to conserve if they don't pay the bills. But if they do pay the bills, the owners have no incentive to make investments in efficiency. So at RentLab, and the reason I put this picture in is that this is one of my favorite pictures, but you end up with a rental like this, where it probably has really great granite countertops and new carpet, but there's no attic insulation. So we're trying to get at the market signals that let us address this and sort of fix that broken incentive loop. So when we heard about ACEEE's efforts to experiment with different ways of engaging tenants and landlords in better information around this, we really were eager to try to assist that effort. And so what we did was we took the early results of the ACEEE experiment and ran those results in our own live, real environment to see how we could get real users to sort of interact with that data, driven by the same idea, which labeling design, if any, impacts web user engagement. And we read response based on either a click through for more details in our platform, a property dashboard, or by clicks through to an external landlord website that gave more information on that property. So we drove people to the website through online advertising. So these are a couple examples of the Facebook and Instagram ads that we ran. And then we also ran Google ads to pull people to the website. None of these referenced sustainability or efficiency. Our goal was to really focus on just generic renters looking for information about the rental, about possible rental availability. So when people clicked on the ads, they were delivered to our map interface, and they were randomly assigned to one of 4 different designs. And these are all, like I said, drawn from ACEEE's experiment. So they should look pretty familiar. So this is the first. This is the cost continuum. We presented it as annual bills per bedroom. The second was the energy score, again, the same as ACEEE set theirs up. There was a third version that looked just like this, but had no energy information. So that was the control setting. And then finally, this was our own, this is our own design, kind of the way we present our map, but this is a color-coded map where the labeling is effectively based on the color of the dot. So the least efficient properties are red, the most efficient are green. And so this was just another, we wanted to test kind of what our own setting looked like. So the results, we got 869 clicks through the ads. 352 of those users clicked on something within the site. And then we were able to use 244 of those clicks. So they were actually interacting with the labels or with the designs that they were being exposed to. Our ads targeted Columbia, Missouri. So that's a city that has really good electric data that we could publicize. And it's a small college town in the Midwest, so kind of typical of a lot of the cities we're working with at the moment. The respondents were very heavily women when coming through Facebook. Through Google Ads, it was a little bit more balanced, but a kind of a bimodal respondent population in terms of age. So what did we find out? So this is our control condition. and here on the left part of the graph, we have the best EUI, or the lowest kilowatt hours per square foot. So these are the most efficient buildings. And on the right, we have the least efficient buildings. So this is a curious response or results that we need to do more investigation on, but the control condition also saw a higher number of clicks on the most efficient properties. So that's something we'll need to understand better with further research. This is the color-coded map condition. This is what they saw when they clicked through. So not a huge amount of difference between the lowest and highest efficiency properties. The third one is the energy score. So with this one, we see a fairly significant drop-off from the highest efficiency properties on the left to the lowest efficiency properties on the right. And the same results for the cost continuum condition. And so both cost continuum and energy score see the biggest drop off between the best properties and the properties with the greatest opportunity for improvement. So that question of how we ended up with more clicks on high efficiency properties in the control design is something we need to answer. But I think we can still look at this outcome, and the higher results, the higher response to high efficiency properties for cost continuum and energy score were are getting it exactly what we had hoped they would do. The color-coded map is an interesting outcome for us. Of course, that's been a feature of our website. It was an interesting experience to build in the sidebars and sort of experiment with how those worked. And there's some real sort of support for trying to build in a more visible label like we saw in that condition. Just one other way of looking at the data. So because we knew we weren't going to have thousands of results, we weren't going to have thousands of users clicking through to the site, we opted to put the same two properties at the top in all of the sidebar conditions. And so by default, we knew these two properties were always going to get more clicks because they were more visible when people came to the site. So what I did was look just at those two properties just to see how those two compared. So if you remember, control, energy score, and cost continuum conditions are the ones that have the sidebar. We picked, for these featured properties, we picked two that were as similar as we could make them. They were closer to campus, which is the driving tenant population in Columbia. They're very similar type. Neither of them have bad reviews online. So we really tried to focus on making those very similar. So in the control condition, you see here that they have a very similar number of clicks, which is what we would expect for buildings that look quite similar like this. But we start to see a pretty significant divergence in the energy score and the cost continuum conditions, which backs up ACEEE's findings that yes, in fact, these labels do impact people's, how people respond and how much they interact with a higher efficiency versus a lower efficiency property. So that's great news. That's exactly the kind of information we wanted to get out of this. Now, in the color-coded map, neither of these properties were featured in any way. They were just another dot on the map. So there was no reason to really expect that they would get a differential number of clicks. But, so like we saw in those overall results, the color-coded map seems to have kind of minimal impact on the overall result. So in terms of our next steps, I think we'd like to repeat this experiment in the future and really work on getting more users to interact. We did find that in any given design condition, about a quarter of the properties had no clicks. And so that had a pretty significant impact on our ability to analyze the data. So if we can drive more users to the site, I think can get more statistically significant results in a future run. Because we're constantly struggling to get tenants and landlords to look at energy data, I'm leaning, I'm sort of inclined to try to hit him over the head with it a little bit. And so I'm very curious about the prospects of combining the color-coded map with a labeling situation, a sidebar situation, where we can really see, get people to interact with that information in a couple of different ways. So those cost and energy score labels both have great potential, and perhaps in combination with sort of a localized comparison that they can look at based on the color coding on the map, we may just be able to see a little bit different result there. And then finally, just for our own, next steps, we'd really like to get further into user testing, understanding how can we sort of elevate energy and sustainability in a way so it is better linked to users' key concerns, their overall rent cost, budget, their location concerns, and how can we kind of link those things together better. And finally, one of the things we got, the responses we got most consistently from people who interacted with the site were, okay, this is great information, but now what's actually available for rent? So our overall goal always has been to get this information to people wherever they're looking for rental properties. And so this just sort of validates that challenge that we need to build this efficiency step, this efficiency into the sort of rental decision-making process that's happening already. That means either very clear links to the available properties that people can then explore actually renting, building this into big sites like apartments.com or Craigslist, and so on. So just trying to figure out how do we make this as sort of pain-free as possible for people to get this type of information. And with that, I will wrap up.
Thanks, Jackie. Really, I love the way you followed up with our research and really put it into the real world. It's great to see it reflected so nicely. Just adding a little bit more credibility, I think, to the fact that these listings really make a difference, or these labels really make a difference. And I think that it naturally follows that Luke will jump in now and talk about how it really works in the real world in Minneapolis. We're excited to hear your insights. Thanks, Luke.
Thanks, and thanks a lot, everybody, and Ruben and Jackie. Really appreciate your presentation so far. And as Ruben said, I'll be providing a little bit of context for another real world example of putting into place energy cost information available at rental time. My name is Luke Hollenkamp. I am with the Sustainability Division of the City of Minneapolis. And I want to first give a little bit of overview of how our time of rent experiment began. We passed as a city a suite of residential energy disclosure policies back in 2019. And the intent was to create a number of policies so that no matter whether you're a homeowner or a renter, you would have access to energy information during the process of finding housing. And these policies, kind of as a suite of policies, were identified in our 2013 Climate Action Plan. The idea being that the policies would help promote energy efficiency and then also housing affordability, which really in the last 9 years since the Climate Action Plan was adopted have become even more important issues, both of those. And as you've heard already from Jackie and Ruben, we saw a lot of benefits to energy disclosure, including awareness of energy for residents and property owners, that this is another piece of key information that can be used when weighing different housing options. It would help address the split incentive by providing some sort of market incentive for energy improvements in the rental housing. And then it would also reduce the energy burden, the energy cost burden that is for households, particularly those that are most sensitive to energy costs. So the suite of policies include three main ordinances. One was what we call the Truth and Sale of Housing Ordinance. This is an existing report that the city's had for, I believe, a few decades now that provided basic health and safety information about a home when it was on the market for purchase. What we added to that was an energy disclosure report, which checks off some additional boxes on whether or not a house has wall insulation, attic insulation, what windows that it has, and what its heating system is. So a little bit more information that can be used at the time of buying a home. Another element of our suite of policies was adding multifamily building benchmarking to what was already our commercial building benchmarking ordinance. This is for the largest buildings in town, over 50,000 square feet. In addition to having to provide energy information publicly, these very, very large multifamily buildings also then had an evaluation component, an audit component included for the first time for low performing buildings. And then specifically what I'm talking about today is then our time of rent reporting for tenants. In essence, what this required was that rental property owners needed to disclose energy use information, in this case, energy cost information, at the time of a rental application. So this is very specifically targeted to where we as a city had some levers, which is the rental application process. Again, the intended impact was to give renters that upfront information, particularly before they've signed in a deadline. Now, the information I'll be going through or presenting here is energy cost information not provided in the rental listings per se, because we don't have any levers to tackle that area, but at the time of rental application. And most rental buildings now require an application to be filled out by tenants. So this would be when a property owner gives an application to a tenant, then that application has to give some sort of information on energy cost to the tenant as well. We worked with our two utilities, Xcel Energy and CenterPoint Energy, since 2008 now, to reduce the barriers and streamline compliance, particular to property owners for this ordinance. And in our local jurisdiction here, Xcel Energy is our electric utility and CenterPoint Energy is our gas utility. So we actually faced a challenge, which is we had to simultaneously work with two utilities, provide energy cost information for two different fuels, electricity and fossil gas. We also ran into a challenge, which is that the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission had rules on the books back in 2018 and necessitated that we had to find different compliance pathways, different data sharing pathways for differing building types. So what that meant in effect was that instead of waiting to get all of that ironed out for all buildings before we proceeded with all buildings, we bifurcated the process. We proceeded with a program to provide energy cost information for 5 or more unit buildings. And simultaneously, we had another process where we tried to find a different solution for 1 to 4 unit buildings that would require a petition to the Public Utilities Commission and then their ultimate approval. So for our 5 or more unit apartments, and I also say less than 50,000 square feet because anything above 50,000 square feet was in that large building benchmarking ordinance. We have a lot of housing in the in Minneapolis. About 32,000 residential units are in this type of housing. That's about half of the total residential rental units. It's spread over 2,100 buildings and about 800 owners. And just geographically, I'll mention that on this map here, where the word Minneapolis is, that's actually where downtown Minneapolis is. And then there's these 2 green outlines. Those are our green zones. Those are environmental justice areas that we spend a lot of time intentionally providing resources to. And all the dots on the screen here are those 5 or more unit apartments. And you can see, since they're not necessarily the largest buildings, they're kind of mid-sized buildings. They're not in the downtown core, but they're kind of spread out around the periphery of the downtown core. What our pathway was then for these rental owners to comply with the ordinance was that they would use some newly created web tools that were created by our utility partners to aggregate the cost data for all of the meters in their building. And then this web tool would also then create an energy report that was specific to that building. And that would include some metrics that included the monthly energy bills, energy cost per square foot and per bedroom. So it was normalized so that you could do as much as possible a apples to apples comparison from one unit to the next in different buildings. And then the property owner would be provided with a unique URL, which would be the way that a tenant could then access the report specific to the building that they were looking at. This is a quick screenshot of what that web tool and process looks like. In the background there is the web tool that was created by both utilities, and they actually use the same vendor so that the result coming out of their individual utilities was consistent. And then on the left, a little bit more in the foreground, is the actual report that a renter could see with some basic information on energy costs as well as size of the building. And then I've highlighted within that report the box that will then show the actual energy cost per square foot and per bedroom for that building. And that's really what what a tenant would be zooming in on and looking at. And then again, there'd have to be 2 reports for each building, one for electricity, one for gas. So the way that a tenant could use this is they could, during the time of reviewing applications for different buildings they may be interested in, they would be able then to use the URLs to access the unique energy reports and then compare them side by side. But what we didn't have is we didn't have a tool though that put them on the same, that had different buildings on the same page, comparing apples to apples, unfortunately. At the same time, we're also looking at 1 to 4 unit rentals. This is about the other 50% of total residential rental units in the city of Minneapolis. And looking at the map here, this is actually spread, all these units are spread much more consistently across the city. There is a much higher concentration of these rental units in those environmental justice green zones. These housing units also house many of our low income and low wealth households in the city. And we've also found that this is much of our least efficient housing stock. Also, this is a lot of our naturally occurring affordable housing within the city of Minneapolis. So this was definitely a priority. Even though we didn't have a pathway forward, we worked with the utilities then to petition for a new methodology to provide data. And we received approval from the Public Utilities Commission in early 2022 to go forward with that process. And in essence, what that process means is that because these are smaller buildings and there's concern over data privacy, we would not be able to provide prospective renters with a single numerical figure that says dollars per square foot or dollars per bedroom. Instead, what we were able to provide is a range of where the average may lie. So what this looks like in practice is there's actual monthly data that a lot of these data tools crunch. That's shown on the left side of the screen here. That information is actually never seen by property owners and by renters. What the property owners and renters can see then is what is derived from that data. So in the case of our larger buildings, 5 and over units, rules set by the Public Utilities Commission say that we can say specifically things like this building over the last 2 years averaged energy costs of $33 per bedroom. What we got permission from the PUC to do is not to provide that exact amount for the 1 to 4 unit buildings, but to provide a range where we'd be able to say for the same building, your average energy cost is within the range of $29 to $40. So it kind of blurs some energy data a little bit, but that helped satisfy the privacy concerns that the Public Utilities Commission had. So the next step for implementing that 1 to 4 unit policy is really to help property owners with compliance. We want to make sure that this is as easy as possible for them to be in compliance with. And that also means that we will have a higher compliance rate ultimately if we make it as easy as we can. So what we at the city are doing with our utility partners is we're actually going to do a lot of the number crunching for the property owners. The city will be providing a list of rental licenses and their addresses. The utilities then will do the energy cost crunching and aggregation for us. And they'll provide that what's called a confidence interval range. That's that range of values. And they'll provide that for each of the addresses on the city's rental list. The city then will create a web page where that information will be freely available to renters. And then the only responsibility from the property owners is that they need to direct prospective renters to that city web page so that they can find that information for that building. We also then are going to spend some time in the future here thinking about what's the most impactful format and visual structure for conveying that information, that confidence interval information to renters. And really this, the report by ACEEE and what we've heard from Jackie too is really going to help inform how we think about that most effective and useful way to convey information. What we've looked at so far, and what we actually filed with the Public Utilities Commission as possible paths forward, is showing that confidence interval methodology for a particular building, but comparing it against a city median. So you get a sense of how that building just compares against average housing stock. What we also think would be very helpful then is to be able to compare one property against each other using this confidence interval methodology. So what's showing on the bottom is two properties against each other. And what you could say with confidence when you look at property A versus property B is that there is a meaningful, i.e. statistical difference in energy costs, and that property B is more energy cost efficient than property A. We'd also be providing caveats that it's going to be really important for a renter to discuss these costs with the property owner too, to see if there's any extenuating factors that could have influenced these costs to be particularly high or particularly low. Also, to better understand as a renter what costs they themselves will be paying versus what costs are already wrapped into their monthly rental structure. So that'll be a very important element that is not portrayed here, but should be in a conversation and will be help informed by this. So just looking forward on this policy, and then to wrap up this presentation, for our rental buildings that are 5 or more units, we currently have our ordinance live and active, and we have property owners that are in compliance and some still bringing themselves into compliance on this. And in essence, it's providing some specific energy cost information, normalized by square foot or bedroom. And what we're going to be launching then later this year, now that we have regulatory approval, is energy cost information for the 1 to 4 unit buildings. And we're going to be incorporating a more visual element to that. And what's still needed as we launch 1 to 4 units and going forward is a way to standardize then these different size buildings so that the reporting is consistent, and that someone looking at an apartment in, let's say, a 4-plex could be able to compare apples to apples against an apartment in a 10-unit building. Currently, right now, we don't have that worked out, but we're going to have to figure that out with these different types of methodologies we have. And that's the end of my conversation or my presentation, and look forward to the Q&A and any conversation after that. Thanks.
Thanks, Luke. It's really great to see Minneapolis taking this step, and I can only imagine how challenging it must have been to work with all these different stakeholders and try to get all this work done. It's really remarkable that you've been able to get this far with this with these policies. So keep up the good work. Been tons of action in the chat and in the Q&A. I'm going to do my best to kind of do double duty here, looking at the chat and the Q&A while also asking and answering questions. Yeah, that's triple duty. But let's start with, there's a question here. Actually, I think that Luke, you might be good to answer this one. Maybe I can step in as well. How do the energy, so is an energy audit required for each rentable unit in order to get the, I guess you're not doing energy scores in yours, you're doing home energy costs. It sounds like you don't need audits for your process. Is that right?
For our rental energy cost disclosure, yes, there's no audit involved in the process. It's a data exercise with the utilities.
So that was a question from Zoe Whidden. And the second part of that question is, how is the home energy score calculated? And that's something that I used for my experiment. We use the home energy score for single family homes and the building asset score for multifamily homes. And this actually ties into a question by Rocky Fernandez also, just notes that energy costs are affected by more than just energy use. I should say more than just the properties of the home. Energy costs are affected by the current costs of the per kilowatt hour. It's also how you use the home, how many people are in the home, and that kind of thing. So very importantly for the home energy score and the building asset score, those are DOE tools that do not take into account, or I should say, they assume a certain level of a certain type and level of energy use in the buildings. And they use things like the building envelope, and I believe the appliances that are in there. I think that Maddie Salzman might be on this call. If you're here and you feel like chiming in with all the mistakes I'm making with how DOE calculates home energy score, please do so. But essentially, these are ways of calculating an energy score regardless of who lives in the house and how they use it, or who lives in the building and how they use it. So energy costs are great because people care about them and they affect decisions, but energy score is arguably a better measure of efficiency. But I think both are important, and showing the energy use in any way is helpful.
Mm-hmm. If you don't mind me adding to that a little bit, this is something we've really been struggling with. It's a really complicated question. And, in our ideal situation, we have access to both of those types of data, both the home energy score related information and actual usage data. Honestly, almost everywhere, we're not working with an ideal data set. So no matter what, we're having to, depending on the community where we're working, we're sort of having to come up with some creative ways to deduce what we can based on what we've got. But I will say that in the absence of home energy score data, we're actually working with a city that builds an element of energy efficiency assessment into their rental inspection process. So they're actually having their inspectors, who are routinely entering these properties anyway, track at least some basic information about that. And then our hope with the RentLab system over time is that we're going to track, we'd like to get in a situation where we can track bills over time and start to look at the patterns. So we start to kind of pull apart what's building related and what's occupant related. It's a long game task for sure.
Yeah, Luke, do you want to comment at all on getting how difficult it is for building owners to get this information to you, or the challenges involved with that?
Well, I just want to go back to the question of kind of energy score versus energy cost. But that's something that we've struggled with as well, and we've primarily gone with energy cost. One of the ideas being too is that provides a means for a prospective renter to ballpark kind of what their cost may be over the course of a year when they look at an average monthly cost. In Minneapolis here, we have, because of very cold winters and warm summers, we have a lot of fluctuation in energy bills month to month, but over the given year, it's relatively consistent. But this methodology we came up with for our smaller buildings, or 1 to 4 unit buildings, which we call that confidence interval methodology. That really originated with our electric utility, Xcel Energy, and they had a statistician on staff that helped create that. And the idea behind that is, by actually not providing a single number, but a range, a confidence interval, it actually then kind of pulls out previous tenant behavior and negates that. And you're looking more at than the energy costs of the asset itself, the physical structure, so that you as a tenant then coming into it would be able to say, well, I maybe am someone that loves keeping my home particularly warm in the winter. But even so, my costs are potentially on the higher end of that range. And it just is a way to kind of divorce the individual previous renter behavior from the assets. And then it helps normalize. And then it actually provides a little bit more of an asset score than a single energy cost would otherwise provide.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and it really nicely marries both systems in a way. Okay, I'm really quickly going to touch on one question by Karen Daniels. She asks if my study tested different income groups or if there was differences in income brackets and how they affected people's valuation of energy efficiency. I was surprised to find we looked at income level, we looked at whether people had a high energy burden or not, we looked at whether they had a severe energy burden, and none of those variables seem to affect people's willingness to pay for energy efficiency, which says to me that there's a desire all across income levels for energy efficiency and that we really need to work harder to allow everybody to access that. Actually, there's a similar, a related question that came up in the chat, Jackie, and I'm going to ask this one to you. Zoe Serrano asks, is there a plan to make these tools available to targeted low-income households who would benefit from living in an energy-efficient home? She says, many of our clients can't pay for their energy bills, don't even know about weatherization or how energy efficiency can really cut down their energy utility bills per month.
I mean, that's absolutely one of our targets, is that low income energy burden. So, you know, the way we typically operate is to deploy to a whole community, but we have talked to certain communities about having a very targeted deployment where we focused on affordable housing or attainable housing, sort of the housing options that might be serving those populations. It's absolutely something that we consider part of our mission.
I think so. I would love to see Rent Lab expanding to especially serve these low-income communities who would really benefit. James Martin Schramm asks, how would a community gather the data to present the home energy score and or month energy bills on a continuum? And Jackie, I know you've struggled with this a lot, is how do we get the data to provide? And I think we talked about this a little bit. You know, if you require a home energy assessment, that's a serious process, and we need an infrastructure we put in place that facilitates this, makes it quicker, and maybe it embeds it in processes that already exist, like Jackie, you were saying. Sometimes, or Luke, in a rental application, it's provided. Do either of you want to comment on that? How do you gather this data? How kind of challenges have you had?
I mean, it is really tricky, just like you said, but you know, as I mentioned in my previous comment, we're in this business of kind of meeting communities wherever they are. And there are communities that have very, very little data. And our focus then is pulling everything we can from the assessor's data, you know, whatever data they have as the city building permit data, trying to just get a picture of where we might focus, say, a building electrification effort. Based on age, whether a building's all electric already, who pays the utility bills, that kind of stuff. So we're trying to build these pictures. And that's the condition of most cities. They don't have a ton of data. And then we move to the cities that, you know, like the one I mentioned, where they're actually building it into their rental inspection. You know, we're using that data as much as we can to, again, build a picture that they can act on. I mean, the whole purpose of the way we look at this is how do we get to actionable data as quickly as we possibly can? And it almost always is sort of a jerry-rigged kind of collage of weird information that we piece together like Frankenstein to be like, okay, I think here's, you know, a list of properties that might be good targets to start with. It's really tricky. And yeah, like Reuven said, I mean, if we've got a community that's got a home energy score requirement or something like that, it's beautiful. But frankly, we have to start with something less than that.
Yeah, we have, I think I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, kind of a patchwork of policies for energy disclosure for different types of housing. So for the owner-occupied housing, you know, a lot of our single-family homes, we already had this truth in sale housing requirement, which was based on having an auditor come to a home and fill out basically a health and safety assessment of a house. So that was an established process. And we were able to launch then an energy kind of add on to that within a year's time, because it wasn't a very heavy lift. We were just modifying something we already did. We had to do education outreach to auditors, but it wasn't creating something from scratch. It was leveraging something that was already occurring in the marketplace. Time of rent energy cost disclosure for rental buildings, though, that is a completely new process that we had to create. And because of that, it ended up being launched, although both ordinances were passed on the exact same day, One was launched within a year, and the other one took 3 years to launch, that being the residential disclosure ordinance. So as much as possible, I'd recommend that municipalities or other forms of government leverage existing tools if they have them. And if they don't, it can be kind of a slog, but you should be able to eventually get there.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. And we have a ton of great questions, about how did we break out the categories and of energy use, and are there privacy issues, and how do you get historical bill data, and what's better to use, and is the percentage paid by, how often is heat included in rent? And these are fantastic questions. I'd love to answer everything, but unfortunately we've come to the end of the time that we have available to us. So I'm going to have to wrap it up, but we're going to share all the questions from the chat with today's speakers, and we can individually try to email you. I'm going to put into the chat my email address, and if any of the speakers want to put their email addresses into the chat as well, you can feel free, and you can just reach out to us directly to talk to whoever you want to. Thank you everybody for coming to today's webinar. And I'm putting up the slide on Beck because I just wanted to reiterate that if you're interested in this kind of research, Beck is a great place to meet and chat about it. I look forward to seeing you at the next webinar and maybe the next Beck webinar. Thank you, everybody, and take care.